Are you looking for a new math curriculum? Well, CTC Math specializes in providing online video tutorials that take a multi-sensory approach to learning. Favorably reviewed in Kathy Duffy's 102 Top Picks and the Old Schoolhouse Crew Review, the lessons are short and concise to help your children break down concepts and appreciate math in a whole new way. The lessons are taught the traditional way, not to the test. Each one of the video tutorials is taught by an internationally acclaimed teacher, Pat Murray, who is renowned for teaching math concepts in a simple, easy-to-understand way and in only a few minutes at a time. Using a multi-sensory approach, having the combination of effective graphics and animation synchronized with the voice of a friendly teacher together with practical assessment, even students who struggled with math are getting fantastic results. And the ones that were doing okay before now are doing brilliantly. Visit CTC Math today and start your free trial. That's ctcmath.com.
This is a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network. Welcome to the Vintage Homeschool Moms Show. Your host, Felice Gerwitz, is an author, a publisher, and your radio show host. She will encourage, educate, and inspire you with answers to your most pressing questions from homeschool, marriage, parenting, and much more. Felice loves to equip moms to live a Christian life because every moment counts. Be sure to visit her website at mediaangels.com. And here's your host, Felice Gerwitz.
Hey friends and welcome. My name is Felice Gerwitz and I am your host for Vintage Homeschool Moms. And today I have a special guest that I want to introduce you to. Leah is an award-winning attorney, author, and speaker who has not only homeschooled but represented homeschool families. Her podcast, Conversation Balloons, is Spotify's top 25% and is on YouTube as well as many other podcast apps. I'm sure you have lots on your phone that you can check her out. Her website is leahfarish.com and it's LeahFarish. And we will have information in the show notes. Today, we are going to talk about something I really haven't visited very often, and that is cultural learning. So you can find today's show notes at Vintage Homeschool Moms. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you for having me, Felice.
No, I'm really excited because I want to delve into this topic of cultural learning, but I also want to get a little bit of an idea of your background and your homeschool journey.
Yeah, I was an attorney and felt very much called to work in the area of religious civil liberties, civil rights, especially representing believing people. And I was doing that, very interested in First Amendment work, getting lots of interesting cases that went to the Supreme Court and everything. But I never planned to homeschool. I had been certified as a teacher in undergraduate at Duke, and took education courses and then taught for 4 years in two private schools in Dallas. But then I had moved into law and was really finding it, gratifying and important. And I never thought I would homeschool because my whole family background was professional educators, lots of public school educators. And I thought, they're the professionals, they're the experts, leave it to the experts. And but my son was in a Montessori school. He was not in a public school, but I just was not satisfied with what they were doing, and I kept having ideas about what he needed. And I was driving down the street one day heading to a teacher conference and thinking about how could I get the teacher to do this? How could I convince her that this is what he needed? And I just thought, why don't I just do this myself?
Yeah.
And I just I was so frustrated, but also intimidated by the idea of
Wow.
how would I fit this into what I thought was my calling
Mm-hmm.
as a lawyer, and I just prayed about it and got to know other homeschooling parents and thought, I just have two kids. I think this is doable. My philosophy was do the things that are unique to me to give to my children that no one else can give, and delegate everything else.
Wonderful.
And so I had a nanny most of the time who would drive them to enrichment things like their PE and their
Mhm.
art classes. I left all the driving to someone else because someone else could do that. Um, and I wasn't, if there were things I wasn't good at, I delegated them.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a full day with my children most of the time. Sometimes it was, but um, my daughter was younger, and when she came along, I decided that homeschooling would be good for her for a while. And I took it kind of year to year.
Mm-hmm. A lot
And
of people do. Yeah.
yeah, so my daughter was entering a grade in elementary school, and 2 weeks later, she came out carrying a whole bunch of stuff. And I said, "What's all this?" And she said, "Well, I cleaned out my desk because I've decided I've had enough. I'm going to homeschool this year."
So funny. A
So
very
I
independent
homeschooled another
thinker.
year.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah,
But it
that's
was it
amazing.
was the dearest, closest time in our
Hmm.
family's life. And like you've said before, really nobody regrets homeschooling.
No.
They sometimes will
Yeah.
regret not homeschooling, but I
Right.
felt really good about the years that we did it.
That's wonderful. And we had a interview. I was on Leah's podcast. And so once that airs, we'll put links in our show notes to that podcast as well. So
Right.
Leah will
Yeah.
share that with me. But and that's what I was saying was that, I know many people who regret their children going back to traditional education more so than I've heard people saying, well, I regret homeschooling. Have never run across people in all my years that have. And so you were able, because you were, already had things going on to make it work for your family. And I've had, at conference, I've had parents who have come up to me, and both of them were doctors, and they were planning to homeschool, similar to what you did. It was interesting because they had different schedules.
Mhm.
And so, like the husband was going to be at home, or they had someone come in who would, be with their children if they were at work. And both of them decided that they weren't going to work full weeks because it was more important during their children's years to homeschool. And so, there all types of families homeschool, and it's a wonderful experience. I have a blog post that I'm going to put a link in the show notes to that kind of gives you a little bit of an outline for those of you that are interested in homeschooling. But today we're going to be talking about culture, Leah, and why is that important to you?
Well, I enjoy other cultures. My father was a commercial pilot, and I grew up traveling
Mm,
and visiting other countries, and my parents modeled that appreciation for a big variety of people. And I was fascinated by the different ways that people communicate, fascinated by languages. And I wanted my children to have some of those experiences, maybe not, you know, traveling the world the way I was able to because it's so expensive if you don't have a father who's a pilot.
right.
But I did want them to see the beauty of the how all people are made in the image of God and how different that can look in different
Hmm.
places. And it gives you humility, and yet it gives you appreciation for your own culture and country.
Mm-hmm.
And it just I think, makes you a more interesting person when you can have that background of broad exposure to a
Oh, I
variety of
love that.
people.
Yeah, I shared with you that that my father lived with us, and I grew up as a first generation Italian. So both my parents were born in Italy. My father was from Messina, and my mother was from Bergamo in Sicily. I still have a cousin who lives right on the Strait of Messina, and all I need to do is get over there, and I would have a place to stay, and he would love to have us. Uh, so it's just something that my children grew up with. You know, they grew up with a grandfather, especially the two older ones knew my mom, and uh, she was something else. She was a whirlwind. Let me just put it that way. We owned an Italian restaurant. So grew up with a lot of, Italian culture and background, and married a man who's German Irish. And so there's a little bit of a clashing of cultures, if you will, more Americanized than not.
Mhm.
But if you ask my children what their heritage is, they all say Italian. Even my grandchildren say they're Italian, and their fathers also, I think he's got a lot of Irish in him. So it's just, I don't know, this Italian just wins out. But I think it's so important for the children to have an idea of cultural, we always said that America was a melting pot, barring political issues at this point in time, but it is so important to understand and to embrace, the varieties of cultures that are out there. So, how did you implement that in your homeschooling, and what do you recommend?
Well, of course, there are all kinds of curricular decisions you can
Hmm.
make and books you can read about other cultures. And the kinds of things that I'm glad that I did were experiential. And we have a couple of universities here in Tulsa that have graduate programs that attract a lot of foreign students. And we would have foreign students come over for meals. And some of them, for many of them, it was the first American home they had ever visited. And there are a large percentage of foreign students who never get to visit in a home in the
Mm.
US. And I wanted to seize that opportunity just to share the love of Christ with people and let my kids see what people acted like, how they ate. We had one foreign student who literally put his face in the plate.
Oh, wow.
Um, and he was a brilliant young man. He just didn't know any better.
Hmm.
And we had very, learned and charming students. These foreign students are the best of the best that their country can send. And so they're usually very polite and very interesting, engaging people, and often very lonely people. They're usually very close to their families back home and miss them intensely.
Hmm.
And one thing that is much easier to do in relating to people from other cultures is to have children around.
Mm.
And so our kids would, bring in their pets to show or bring in their toys. And often these students had younger siblings that they missed. And sometimes they'd even get choked up just
Oh.
being around children because on a college campus, you never see children. And so it meant a lot to the students as well. But the benefit to my kids would be to hear these accents, to hear the different ways that, someone from Syria or someone from China or Germany would express themselves. And they would maybe show them stamps or coins, or we would study those, you know, flags from other countries or something in school, and they'd see the people that actually use those kind of things. And another thing that we did what was have cultural parties. So we had two friends of mine through professional work that were from Brazil, and they were thrilled to kind of lead the celebration of Brazilian life and culture. And we had some food for the children to taste, and we probably had 50 kids over here
Wonderful.
learning about Brazil, and they showed their maps, and their accents were very beautiful, and they spoke Portuguese for the kids, and it just personalizes this kind of thing. And of course, the Q&A is gold, to
Right.
hear what the kids want to know. Where
Yeah.
do you go to the bathroom?
Yeah.
Or do they spank children in Brazil?
So
Stuff like
funny.
that. And they just learn so much. So, um,
I love
one
that.
one thing that we did was try to learn some of the languages. We had
Mm.
a Chinese friend try to teach us some Chinese. It was overwhelming.
Yeah.
But as soon,
We had a friend who they did things differently. Like they learned to fence. That was their sport. My kids did baseball and softball. Their kids fenced. But one of
Mhm.
the young men wanted to learn how to speak Chinese, and he did. That was his course, and he just was really good at it. And he would practice on us, and we had no idea what he was saying.
Yeah,
Oh gosh. But yeah, that's wonderful.
I told my daughter, she was about 5 or 6. I said, "We're going to the park today with two ladies from the university," and she said, "Okay, good." And she said, "Do they speak English?" She was so used to being around people that didn't, especially the spouses of foreign
Okay.
students would
Yeah.
often not know any English. And I had to say, "Well, actually, they don't." And another time we did a mission trip to Mexico. We did that a couple of years as a family, and it was so wonderful. Several families with homeschooling children went. We were able to go in the spring when most, traditional school children couldn't travel. And we were talking, and we had learned some Spanish. And I said, "Now I want you to speak Spanish with the children when we're there." And she said, "Mommy, I love my language. I just don't want to part with it."
I always say children typically will emulate the parents' language. She must have heard you phrase things that way. That is so cute. We did a cultural fair at one point, and I remember meeting this family, and they were new to homeschooling. So our group actually went from very small to huge at one point in time, and they were Lithuanian. And on the backs of their jerseys were Lithuanian names. And I thought, oh, how nice, this is all, a culture fair. And I wonder, and I asked a friend of mine who knew them. Thankfully, I didn't ask this parent. It probably wouldn't have gone over well. Like, what is their names in English? And they said, no, those are their names. And it was, Geodra, Victoria but it was Victorija with a little
Wow.
accent, so, Gintras and Linus and, so they really not only embraced their culture, but they also sent their children to Lithuanian camp every summer. But the most hilarious thing is the two girls, the oldest two, went to Lithuania when they were I believe when they were in high school or had graduated from high school and were going into college. And when they came back, they were sharing some really funny stories. And one of them, when they asked, where are the restrooms, they basically were translated into saying, where's the outhouse? And people were looking at them laughing. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, these people who lived and breathed their culture at home, and that was what my parents always would say. Like my mother would ask me, well, how do you say that in Italian? And I said, Mom, why are you asking me this? Because I had taken some Italian courses. And she said, because in dialect, even my mom and dad's different dialects, sometimes their words didn't mean the same, didn't They would say the word, but it was a different word for the same thing. And so she was expecting me and my vast non-knowledge of Italian to be able to help them with whatever word they were trying to say. But there's a lot of language barriers even within a culture. But, I'm sure you have
Yeah.
so many stories that you can share. And I think it it
Speaking
was
of
wonderful.
language barriers, my son, I was teaching him about Julius Caesar, and I said he was a Roman emperor and he spoke Latin. And my son said, "How did they understand him?"
Because they're Romans, right? And shouldn't speak Italian. Oh, funny. Yeah, and I think that's one of the blessings of homeschooling, Leah, is that you were able to capture a very unique, part of your, something you wanted to do with your children, but not only that, something that within the community, that was able to enrich your children's education. And I think those are things that are so important. We went to a Greek restaurant that was up in the Tampa area, and there at that point they even had the sponge boats coming in. They no longer have them. The waterways now can't harvest them anymore. But and so there were so many things that we did that I think enriched their culture. And none of us at that point in time, I actually do like Greek food, but my family and my husband especially is not very adventurous. He
Hmm.
always said, "Well, when I go to Italy with you, can I bring a jar of peanut butter?" I said,
Oh.
I said they probably would love it because that's what my Chilean friends. And I think just because of our homeschool network here, my one of my best friends was French and from France, and she had a very heavy French accent. And I took a lot of French in college because that was the language I loved. And the other one was Chilean, so spoke Spanish. And when my friend's mother would come, I would try to speak to her in French, and she kind of had this cute little smile on her face, and I knew I was butchering the language. But I
Mhm.
think that's important too. Like the children were able to see that just in our friendships here in town, and I think that's important for them to understand. So there are so many ways you can do it, even if you don't have the resources that you did. Like, can you give us like an idea of like if you wanted to do that, if you have a university, maybe one of the listeners, how would you go about doing that? Is there someone you would contact at the college?
Mhm. Yeah, if you don't have an international students ministry uh, contact, uh, some campuses have such a person
Okay.
that you can talk to that's oriented to Christian um, ideals, but they don't just work with Christian students, obviously. If you don't
Mhm.
have that, I would call a department, maybe the graduate school. You actually probably have more foreign students at the graduate level than undergraduate,
Mhm.
and ask if there are students that like don't have a place to go over the Christmas vacation or something, start with that. Um, and
Yeah.
they will probably put you in touch with something. The dean of students might know of of a way to connect students with the community, or you can go to community events that are at the university and meet students informally. That way you can just network with them.
It's
Um,
wonderful. Yeah, there's
one,
exchange programs too. I know there's a friend of mine that was a homeschool mom, and when she graduated her kids, that was something that she did is she worked with the exchange students that came over and placed them in families. So yeah,
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 yeah, you can make a big commitment, which we never did.
yeah.
And I never had students uh, be alone with my children because I
Mhm.
really didn't know them and didn't know
Right.
their full story. So, we have to be prudent, just like we do with
Right.
any other strangers.
Absolutely.
But it was always great experiences. Another thing that we did was when we would travel, either overseas or here at home, we would always try to go to a worship service. And one year we even, when we were in another state, we had the kids in a vacation Bible school of a church there that they still remember. And one time we were skiing and we found out that there was a worship service held on the slopes that Sunday morning, and we attended that.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Of course, when we went to Rome, we went to St. Peter's and we prayed
Been there.
together. We're not Catholic, but we honored the Christ honoring that was there, and
Right.
were inspired by our.
Yeah, I've been
That's the
there.
heritage of
Yeah, of the
almost
church.
everybody
Right.
who's a Christian is
Hmm.
either the Eastern or Western
Faith. Yeah.
church. So I think
Beautiful.
that shows them the unity of the body of Christ. Sometimes, like when we went to Germany, we visited some friends who are missionaries in
Hmm.
outside of Berlin, and always we tried to find out and encourage the the spiritual temperature of the place, and find out what it was like to be a Christian in that place, how the church was doing there, what were they doing that was reaching their culture there. And
Yeah, I think that's so important to the children are going to know what's important to your family. And a couple of things, I had my Chilean friend, she and her husband, especially when they started putting their children in, they chose, we are Catholic, but they chose a Christian high school in this that was really good in this area. And so he felt that it was very important to keep his roots in the Catholic faith. So they would plan like a trip to France, and they did a lot of pilgrimages and cathedrals. And I was sharing this story with a friend of mine who has a big ministry, and he said that he struggled with atheism when he was in high school. And his mother told him, if you and your brother graduate with honors, they were the same year, different fathers, I will give you both a trip to Europe. And he said, what high schooler doesn't want to go to Europe for the year? So, it was before gap years were a thing. And, um, and so he said, yes, well, I'll do it. And he said, while he was there, he was living an atheist lifestyle and loving it. But what drew him were the Catholic churches. And he said, for some reason, he wanted to go in. And he said, not to worship, but just to sit. And because his family, I think his grandfather was a Baptist pastor. I don't know, the story is amazing how he got to atheism. But he said, when he sat there and looked at the art and the depictions, he said it just did, he loved art, and he said it did something to his soul. And so he shared that by the time he was done after that year, he wanted to convert to Catholicism based on the cathedrals.
yeah,
And, it's something the Lord calls us. And even if I think it's beautiful that you went to a worship service on the mountain. My son's in the military, and he said he was in the Ranger program, and it's like 62 days, my gosh, of, they don't let you eat, they don't let you sleep, and they're testing these boys out. And he said at the end they had a service, and he showed us a picture of the Catholic service, and there had to be like 400 kids. It looked a lot. It wasn't that many. And then he said the same thing with the ecumenical service. He said everyone went because they realized only by the grace of God did they get through, And he said he's never prayed so much. But I think, where does that come from, Leah? It comes from you exposing your children to these things. And that's so beautiful. I mean, people go on vacation and never even think about going to church. And I think that has to be, for us especially, the kids played sports. They were on travel teams. They had to be on the field at 8 o'clock. And we would say to the coach, my son will be there, or my daughter, but we're going to the earliest service we can find, which happened to be at 8, And one of the dads we ran into years later, and he said, I still remember that,
yeah.
the Gerwitz kids would go. And
Oh,
so, you know, that doesn't mean everyone has to. It just meant this is what we were doing with our family. And I so love that. And I'm sure your children are going to continue that with their children someday. So I think, we talk about leaving a legacy, and what a beautiful legacy. I mean, I love the cultural aspect of it, but for me, just you sharing about the spiritual aspect is so beautiful. And I think that's,
And one thing you can do that isn't expensive, just in your own town, if you have these other places of worship,
Mhm.
you can take them to a synagogue. If you're not comfortable with being there during a Friday night service, you can just ask to visit the
Mhm.
temple with your children. And they have Israel celebrations. You can learn about Israel that way. You can visit a Greek Orthodox church, and you're learning about Orthodoxy to some extent, but you're also learning about Greece.
Mhm.
And almost every church has a historical root in another country. So a lot of new Protestant churches are kind of just storefront, but
Right.
they all have a culture, and
Right.
you
Some of the
can
older buildings, I know we've lost some of that. Our church is a mixture.
Mhm.
But I think that we've lost some of that with the newer buildings. But it's so beautiful. I mean, I've been to St. Peter's, and all I wanted to do was just sit there, and we saw part of the Sistine Chapel, but it was being repaired when I was there. That was so long ago when I was in high school, and they had scaffolding, and so we could only just kind of peer in because of all the years of holding masses there. The candles, the soot from the candles had marred, and so you could see where they had part of it restored and part of it was not. But when you look at that and you look at to me, it hits you just at a deeper level, which I think is beautiful. um, Anything else you wanted to add to that? Because I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk a tiny bit about the legalities of homeschooling. I know we're talking about culture and the spiritual aspect of it, but it is so important for parents. I know in some states right now. Well, first of all, did you have anything else you wanted to add to the spiritual aspect of
I,
the
I think
homeschooling?
that pretty much covers
Okay.
it.
Okay, wonderful. I didn't want to jump, if you had
Yeah.
something. But I know there are some states right now, and I know all of us, especially if you've ever homeschooled, if you're in the midst of it, or if you're a graduated homeschool parents, but some of the legislatures, I don't know what they're doing, are trying to make it very difficult for homeschool parents when I thought it was over and done. And I really feel a couple of things, Leah. Number one, homeschooling is a threat to obviously to some people, obviously not all. And secondly, in some states where, I heard someone flippantly say, well, just move. Parents cannot just move. Some people don't have the resources or the ability to just pick up their family and leave. But I know, I forget what state it was that just passed a law saying that they had to oversee the homeschool parents' curriculum, I believe. And
Mhm.
that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's concerning. Yeah, it's interesting that you use the word threat. Unfortunately, that's true. And there's an impulse in people like we see in First Samuel 8, where the people asked for a king, and they said, "We want a king to rule over us, so that we
Yeah.
will
Big
be like
mistake.
other nations
Yeah.
and to go before us in battle." And I think that a lot of people want traditional schooling because they want someone to run it and take responsibility. They want to be like everyone else.
Hmm.
Um, they want to fit in and have everyone uniform and compliant. And they want someone to make the hard decisions and do, you know, be trained and take care of all the problems that their children present. None of those are good reasons for an education program.
Absolutely.
Um, and so this independence that homeschooling produces, we see it in the Cardus, CARDUS survey about homeschooling that came out a few years ago that shows homeschoolers are more likely to vote, they're more likely to volunteer, they have a, a better sense of purpose in their lives, and I think they're less likely to work for the government. They may be in the military, but to be part of the machine, they don't necessarily feel
Mm-hmm.
compelled to do that. They are engaged and they have a sense of ownership in how things are done.
Mm-hmm.
And they tend to be entrepreneurial because of this early experience of we do things according to our family culture and we ask questions and we're free to think for ourselves. And so um, I every state has truancy laws that, if you violate them by not educating your child in some way, you can be prosecuted. And there were a few families that I had to represent because of this accusation of truancy. And if you want to know the laws in your state, you can look at the HSLDA website and other
Yes.
places. And you can even call your state Department of Education and ask, what are the laws? They vary, like you say, according to state. But I think there's a greater openness now to schooling at home because of COVID. There are a
Mm-hmm.
lot more people that even homeschool themselves. One of the judges that I went before in representing on a truancy case said, I homeschool my children.
Right.
And so,
I know it's gotten to the point where it's not as odd. The children, two of my kids went to the same college for a couple of years because my daughter's a little bit older than my son, and so she transferred to his school, and they met some kids, and he goes, "Oh, I was homeschooled," and and somehow they were talking about parents and everything, and so they would say, "My dad's a contractor, and my mom, just look her up." And they were because they couldn't explain what I did. Does media, she writes, she, does online classes, she works, all this stuff. It was just too much. So they
uh,
thought they were being flippant. Well, the friend texted them and said, "Oh my gosh, your mom's media angels. We used her curriculum when I homeschooled."
oh,
Funniest thing ever. How funny is that? I mean, what are the odds? But but that happens now that somebody who's homeschooling. I'm sure even if people have not homeschooled, my son-in-law was not homeschooled, but his cousin's homeschooled. So someone who either close to you as a family member or someone that you've met, especially as people have. My niece is a doctor. She was homeschooled until high school. So there's so many people in the workforce now that have homeschooled, and some of them are quite notable, as you stated. So um, amazing, legacy that we have as homeschoolers, and so wonderful of you, Leah. God bless you that you probably could have practiced any type of law. And, I know personal injury is very lucrative. And probably this one it probably is one of the most rewarding, I'm sure. But, just wonderful that you've chosen this, the social justice issues. So, you
thank you.
know, yeah, just amazing. So,
I would encourage people if they're deciding to homeschool to if sports are really important to you or a certain track toward college, to find out what's available in terms of or music. Like in some states, you can avail yourself of parts of the public school
right.
program. You can be involved in athletics. You can be involved in music or the marching band or, uh, you know, different enrichment programs. You can
Mhm.
have concurrent enrollment with a college, and all that is paid for then. So be aware that some states are very open and flexible with that kind of thing. Sometimes here in my state, it's on a district level, so it's pretty granular. You have to find out, would I be, giving up a certain kind of sports program if I homeschool?
Right.
But again, the districts are getting more open to including
Right.
their homeschool kids in part of their day.
Right.
But there can be a possessiveness about that, and
Right.
you just don't
You have to
know.
be aware and do your research. In fact, one of my previous podcasts on my child wants to play sports help, and I had a mom who emailed me and asked a follow-up questions because in her town she's in a rural area, but there are still so many things you can do. There are these tryouts that are available. You can start your own team. There's so much you can do. But in Florida, one of the sports mommies in Miami, I believe, and ended up suing the state
Mm.
for that ability to be able to do it at that point in time, which was so many years ago. And now my children played in a private Christian high school, and they're very open to homeschoolers because they're dedicated and so forth. But there, just so much to know and learn. And as parents, I think one of the things I love learning, and I was able to learn alongside my children, and it sounds like you were as well. So, any last
Mm.
words, Leah, before we leave? And again, I'll have Leah Farish, I'll have your URL to your website so people can find you and your podcast. Share
Yeah.
with the audience anything you'd like to leave them with.
Well, thank you. I just enjoyed my years of homeschooling so much, and I've heard some homeschoolers on podcasts and things say it's a total commitment. It's a 24/7 thing. Well, in a way, yes, parenting is a total
Right.
commitment. But I found ways to homeschool in parts and for the seasons of our lives in our family where God wanted us to do it. And I would just say, listen to the Holy Spirit and follow his leading.
Amen. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Leah. I so appreciated getting to meet you on your podcast and as well as having you here on mine.
Thank you.
So, friends, yeah, thank you. So, you can find more information about cultural learning, the name of this particular show, at vintagehomeschoolmoms.com. Download us on your favorite app. And, give us a 5-star rating. I don't even know if it's 5 or 4 star, but whatever. I never remember to ask people to do that. Only been doing this for however many years, 11 at this point. So just loved your heart and how you incorporated homeschooling. It wasn't impossible for you. And obviously, just sharing your story, I think, gives people a lot of hope. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Bye bye.